2000, the British are 4 times bigger. 2050, India is 4 times bigger. That's a major structural shift, which is why I wrote a Financial Times article saying it's time for UK to give up its permanent seat in the Security Council to India. You know, when Donald Trump first launched his trade war against China in his first term in 2018, the Chinese were defenseless. They didn't know what to do. And they were running around in circles trying to figure out how to respond to Donald Trump. It's important to understand that in our times, you must be prepared for some big surprises. So what I'm going to do is mention 2 structural shifts and 2 recent short-term surprises that have been, in some ways been a shock to global geopolitics. The first structural shift, of course, let's say if we compare, let's look at the 2 biggest giants in Asia, China and then India. In the case of China, in the year 1980, the combined GNP of the European Union was 10 times bigger than China, 1980. Today, European Union and China are about the same size. And by 2050, European Union will be half the size of China. So in one human lifetime, the European Union goes from being 10 times bigger than China to becoming half the size of China. Just one structural shift. But the Europeans haven't woken up and realized that that's where they are today.
They're on holiday.
And
September.
so that's right. They're still on vacation. In the case of India, I like to compare India to the United Kingdom, right? Because, I mean, that's a natural comparison. It's hard to believe that 100 years from now, 300 million of our ancestors from India were ruled by 100,000 Englishmen, right? 100 years ago, amazingly. And today, if you send 100,000 Englishmen to India, they'll be massacred. So, and even if you compare the British and UK and India, as recently as the year 2000, the British economy was close to 4 times bigger than India's, 3.6 times bigger, year 2000. Today, UK is smaller than India. And by 2050, India will be 4 times bigger than UK. So look at that. 2000, the British are 4 times bigger. 2050, India is 4 times bigger. That's a major structural shift, which is why I wrote a Financial Times article saying it's time for UK to give up its permanent seat in the Security Council to India. I mean, the British should be gracious about it, right? They got to rule India for 200 years, so the least they can do is repay back India by giving their permanent seat to India. I'm surprised that that suggestion wasn't picked up in India by more people, you know. So when if those of you who have connections in Delhi, please call them and say, please echo that call. and I want to emphasize that this is not a frivolous point. This is actually a serious point. The one thing I learned after being ambassador to the UN for over 10 years is that the founders of the UN intended the veto to be given to the great powers of the day and not the great powers of yesterday, which is why the British have gone by their sell-by date already. And it's time for the British to give up their seat, their permanent seat. And I want to emphasize that the British are acutely aware that their seat is hard to justify, which is why they haven't used their veto for over 40 years, 50 years. They dare not use their veto. The minute they use their veto, I really want to say, who are you? That's why they don't even dare to. So they are internally aware that the sell-by date has come. You know, when Donald Trump first launched his trade war against China in his first term in 2018, the Chinese were defenseless. They didn't know what to do. And they were running around in circles trying to figure out how to respond to Donald Trump. And so they couldn't retaliate. They just had to take whatever Trump hurled at them. This time around, the Chinese are able to draw a red line in the sand and say, oh, watch out. You touch me, I'm going to touch you equally painfully. And as you know, when they cut off the supply of rare earths and magnets, the pain was so excruciating. Suddenly you notice that the Trump administration is so polite towards China. Now, you look at the tone they adopt when they speak to China. So in the last 6 months, the big shift is that suddenly US has implicitly accepted China as its peer competitor. This just happened in the last few months. Big shift. And the other big surprise, if you had told me in January this year that, India, which has been cultivated by president after president by the US, right, from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush to Barack Obama to Donald Trump 1 to Joe Biden, that this 27 years of cultivation would be wiped out in a few weeks. I would have said impossible. This is a deep commitment on the part of the US to the US-India relationship. It's bipartisan, one of the few bipartisan things. He will hold steady regardless of what happens. But you've seen how damaged the relationship has become. And it's amazingly painful because there are lots of unnecessary slights and blows to India. Like calling India a dead economy, right? Imposing additional tariffs on India for buying Russian oil. Excuse me, China buys more Russian oil. How much will tariffs increase on China? 0. See? That's what I mean about China. And then look at the way Asim Munir was invited to the White House. Calculated insult. So all these things show that sometimes in geopolitics, what you don't expect can also happen. Current situation, the key word you got to understand is complexity. And it's extremely complex because there are a lot of moving parts all the time, So for a start, clearly at the highest strategic level, as you know, in the Cold War was bipolar. The Cold War ended, became unipolar. And now we have a strange combination of both a bipolar and multipolar world. Because clearly now there's no doubt that China is effectively the number 2 power in the world. And the fact that they were able to, check President Trump so clearly shows that they are aware of their leverage and what they can do. And increasingly, people also recognize China as a peer competitor of the US. And I want to emphasize that the hold that China has over the US is not just in rare earths and minerals. That's just the first shot. But the Chinese have decided a long time ago that to ensure that the United States is strategically dependent on China, they must increase their share of global manufacturing. And as you know, China's share of global manufacturing in 2000 was 5 or 6%, but by 2030 it'll be 45%. And I've spoken to some American CEOs, who told me that it is now the situation where if you want to manufacture almost anything in the world, in one way or another, you'll need some parts from China. And if those parts don't come, then the US is in trouble too. So this CEO told me, if the Chinese just stop exporting everything, watch what happens to the American economy. And I think that realization means that the United States has to treat China with a far greater degree of caution than it did in the past. So that's the bipolar dimension. But at the same time, it's clear that other poles are also emerging and have to be accepted. Clearly, India is going to be the third pole. In India is, now in theory, the 5th largest economy. By 2030, it'll be the 3rd largest economy. It'll overtake Japan and Germany without any doubt whatsoever. So India has the capacity to be the third pole. But to function as a third pole, it's best for India to be like the animal on the seesaw, somewhere in the middle. So if one side you have China, on the other side you have US, where India puts its foot determines where the seesaw goes, So that's an ideal position for India to be in that competition, which means that you want to have some degree of functioning relationship with both and the capacity to talk to both.